All right. So today we're going to talk about my favorite herbalist of all history. The more I learn about this guy, the more I love this guy. This book is pretty much available at any used bookstore, anything. You should never pay more than like $5 or $6 for this thing. There's like millions of copies around the world. So we're talking about my favorite, Nicholas Culpepper. Okay. He was born in 1616 and died in 1654. Doesn't sound like a lot, right? So he was what, 40, 38? How old was he? He died in 1954, 38? 38. So that doesn't seem like a lot, right? But when we look at history, that is pretty much outliving the life expectancy of the time. So Nicholas Culpepper, to me and to many people, he is considered, I call him the father of modern Western herbalism. When I was writing that today, I was thinking, who is the mother of modern Western herbalism? I don't know. I don't know if anybody jumps out as like the clear candidate. There's a lot of people, probably a lot of people we never knew because of history too. But he's considered the father of modern Western herbalism. So we have to understand the time he is living. So this is a time, he's in Britain. This is all in England. This is the time of famine, disease, death ravaging Britain. This is the Civil War of Britain. This is where the famous Roundheads were fighting. London was one of the biggest cities in the world at the time, over 400,000 people. This is in, again, 1616. Okay. We have plagues. We have bubonic plague, which was horrible. We have plagues. We have food insecurity. So over 45,000 people in London died alone in the city limits from bubonic plague. No place for the poor to get food. There was no support system. More people died in London than was born every year for quite a while. So 45,000, when we talk about COVID, that might not seem like a lot. That's over 10% of the population died in a year alone. So I mean, that's a lot of people. Poor water, no sewage, right? No concept of germs in England, even though Chinese have an idea. Remember how when we talked about Hildegard von Bingen from around 1000? She talked about the importance of hand washing and talked about germs. This is why when that fact with her is pretty revolutionary, because we're 600 years later, there's still no concept of rinsing your hands, washing your hands, no concept of doing that after you go to the bathroom. There is no sewage in England that is. So basically the problem is, I don't know if you know this about history, sewage and water are the same systems. They're not really separated. So whatever disease is, in there, it's spreading through drinking water too. And there's no really sanitary water, right? Okay. This is the time we're in. Life expectancy at this time, 28 years. So he lived to be 38. He outdid it by quite a ways. And would probably have lived a lot longer. He ends up dying from a wound in the war. What's that? Yeah. So he outlived everybody by at least 10 years, but we'll see later, he got a wound during a war and it got infected. So yeah, the life expectancy is about 28 years old. Some places say up to 35, somewhere in that range, but most people say about 28. So he accomplished a lot of stuff in a short time. It's crazy in older times how much people accomplish by the time they're like 25 or 30 compared to now, right? Because I mean, people are practicing medicine at like 16 and stuff back in the old days. Okay.
So did you say there was no, so London, they didn't have a sewage?
There was sewage, but sewage was not really separate from other water sources. There was mixing and contamination, and sewage wasn't thought as having disease. So it wasn't really, it's running through like the gutters of the streets, and there's not a way of disposing it. It's going into all the rivers and canals that people are swimming in and getting water from. So yeah, there's no idea of concept of sanitation or germs at this time in history.
Rome had a sewage.
Yeah,
Like
yeah. So I mean, there's a system there, but it's not completely like separated, and it's all intermixing with other water sources, and it's standing in places. And yeah, remember, bubonic plague was spread by rats, so there's a rats infestation at this time also. Okay, so that is like the world at the time. This is a time of great revolution in England and great chaos and death. The medical community at the time we're in a state now where we went from, right, the Renaissance and Paracelsus, and now we're in this time where medical groups have now kind of appeared, and they've taken like a stranglehold over the world. Medical doctor groups. So William Harvey is a famous person who's considered the founder of modern medicine. He is alive at this time. He formed one of the first medical societies in England, and he is basically the opposite arch rival of Nicholas Culpepper, if there ever could be an arch rival. So the College of Physicians of London exists, which still exists today. So there's only 30 doctors in this whole society. So 400,000 people in London alone, that's not including suburbs, 30 doctors. So they've got this thing clamped down, right? It's very controlled. Everyone else, only the rich could afford to see doctors. You probably didn't want to see a doctor at this time anyway. This is where a lot of natural medicine revolutions come from, because we're still talking bleeding and laxatives and heavy metals. I mean, this is like, you wouldn't probably want to be doctored that much at this time. Okay, so only the rich could afford doctors. Everybody else had to resort to unlicensed practitioner. All physicians at this time, remember, modern medicine as we know it in the West with drug therapy we're talking a long ways down the road, 1900s, right? So even the physicians that are medical are still using Galen's system of medicine, hot and cold and all these things we've talked about. Okay. So it's very controlled. However, at this time, the Society of Apothecaries starts to come to power. So at this time, doctors didn't sell the drugs or herbs that they prescribed. They were sold by apothecaries. Okay. So these apothecaries eventually start to rise to power naturally. Sounds familiar to today. Doctors and pharmacists in some states are fighting for rights and things like that, turf wars. Okay, so doctors considered the apothecaries kind of like their servants, but the apothecaries start to rise to power. Okay, so there is an official pharmacopoeia of London. You can get this online. There's a lot of herbal medicine formulas. There's like hundreds and hundreds of formulas. So physicians had their own police force who could actually fine and jail practitioners and other people they deemed touching their turf, just like today, right? If you put up a shingle and said just the wrong thing, this will still happen to you pretty quick, right? So King James of England had malaria. He was treated by this famous physician, William Harvey, and he died. King Charles did not punish the physicians at the time, but it obviously starts a trend of the royal family liking herbal medicine. Okay. Right? If the greatest of the greats, someone dies under their care, right? Then you maybe start to think second thoughts. Okay. We also have kind of like a spiritual religious war at this time. We have the Puritans, right? Felt the plague was divine. So there's like a little bit of a religious, like also revolution and debate. Everything's in debate at this time. Doctors were charging huge prices, like exponentially, probably about like paying out of pocket for stuff today if you don't have insurance. So during the plague, most all the physicians either die or they leave London to get into the countryside. So at one point, there's only 4 physicians left in all of London during the height of the plague. But the apothecaries all stayed open. And this is where they seized their rise to power. Okay. They began actually serving the people and selling direct to patients. This is happening right now, right? We now have apps online where you can see a doctor quote, which means you take like a 3-question survey. You don't actually talk to anybody. And they send you your prescription meds, and every is like bypassing the doctor, kind of. Okay. Okay. So all kinds of healers are trying to help people that are sick, and these healers do not abandon the common people of London. So in 1634, Culpepper moved to London at the height of like this drama. He took his first job as an apprentice to a master and an apothecary. So back then you were paid, you lived with the master, you were pretty much an indentured servant. You had no rights. You could be fired at any time. You know, all the pay was kind of like determined by the apothecaries. So it's not as glorious as it sounds, right? But the master did teach him all of the skills. The physician's Bible that we talked about is written in Latin. This is a theme we see in medicine a lot, right? Remember how Paracelsus didn't like this? Remember that all the textbooks were written in Latin and not written in common folk language, like German? So Culpepper could read Latin, even though his master could not. Most apothecaries could not read either. So basically, he kind of had secret keys to the doctor's playbook. So he basically knew everything they knew. So the apothecaries needed foreign spices and supplies. Physicians start raiding apothecaries, and the apothecaries obviously form a guild and fight back. So everybody is fighting in this stage of time. And also the common people are in confronting the monarchy and the king at the time. They are in revolt. This is like a revolt phase of England. People are dying, fighting. They're fighting to challenge the establishment, the taxes. There's also like the rise of the Church of England. So there's like this interesting Church of England, Protestant like revolt and fight going on. Religious radicalism, anti-establishment, everything's like kind of in a fever pitch. Okay. Culpepper's master left for Europe, and he was passed around to different masters, but he really never learned much. and a physician treated his own mother's breast lump with a lead remedy, which would have been used back then, and she died. And this caused Culpepper to even lose more respect for kind of the medical community because they died under her care, as most people would have, right? So he also, Culpepper, a true renegade, he also became upset because the apothecaries were rising to power and starting to police and control and tell people what they could do or not, and started obviously rising their prices so the common folk could not afford it. Okay. He doesn't like that either. So he actually sets up what would be called an illegal medical practice outside of London. He marries the daughter of a rich merchant. The dowry allowed him to set up his practice. His practice grew rapidly. He offered local wild crafted remedies that he made and harvested himself, which allowed him to sell remedies cheaper than any apothecary who was getting stuff from, remember at the time, this would have been Greek and Roman medicine. All the herbs that were used, this is like an important theme of Culpepper's time, would have been exotic spices and things from where the Greeks and Romans would have been, right? Would have been ginger and turmeric and all these things, but there were no English herbs in this apothecary because nobody knew about, nobody is using them. They were just relying on all the Greek wisdom before them. Does that make sense? Okay, everybody's okay with that? There's no local remedies at this time. Okay, so he grew rapidly. He treated everyone, no matter how sick or poor. He is known to, he said this himself, he offered an infusion of hope. That was his saying. In a time where there was not much hope. And he also said that no person deserved to starve, either from lack of food or lack of medicine. So he treated about 40 or more patients a day, which is a lot, even in today's standards, right? Each morning, and then in the afternoon and night, he made all of his medicines. But he was a master apothecarius, meaning he knew how to make syrup, salves, oils, liniments, tinctures were the common at this time, pills, capsules, everything. Okay, no concept of bacteria, right? He also is renowned for starting a style of practice where he actually sat down with patients, talked with each of them, got to know them, examined their body, and he actually even took their pulse. So he has written a lot about pulse diagnosis. Most physicians at the time did none of this, didn't take the pulse, didn't actually talk to people very much, kind of like modern times, right? Not much of a consultation, right? Okay. Here's something interesting that he does, though, is that he uses astrology in his medical practice. It's also interesting to note, I didn't know this till I watched this one documentary, that astrology was actually considered counterculture at the time, from the sense that a lot of the common people would have known it. And there was even a lot of, like, remember how we talked about religions actually use astrology at this time, and then eventually there's this breaking away from it. So it's an interesting astrology thing. So he used terminology and concepts that a lot of doctors did not know, which drove them crazy. And this is a time of like astrology revival. I guess books on astrology were like some of the biggest sellers in England at the time. Okay. Okay. I have a lot of notes here because this is my favorite guy. So there's protests all over England. Parliament was in fight with the king, civil war. The king even left London at the time. different religious groups were fighting and killing each other, right? Catholics and Protestants were fighting. There was like actually death. There was other reasons for fighting. Culpepper was accused of about every possible thing imaginable, including being a witch, which got him, I'm sure, like attacked by some religious people. Gosh, I have some really in-depth notes. Let me see if any of this is important though. I do, yeah, these are really extensive. So this is interesting. In 1644, Culpepper wrote a book with another famous astrologer called Prophecy of the White King, which outlined the death of the monarchy, which did happen actually. So 1649, King Charles executed, beheaded. The world, England falls into further chaos. And then Culpepper starts what to me seems like common sense stuff. He publishes an English version of the College of Physicians Pharmacopoeia. So he basically publishes the entire secret medical knowledge of the regular doctors, which to us seems, yeah, cool. But this would have been like this got him, I mean, they tried to kill him, everything. Like he was tried to throw him in jail many times and harass him constantly. So he became public enemy number one with the regular medical doctors at the time. Culpepper just really wanted everybody to have access to information. Okay, he also included some of his own recipes. It was his attack to break down the monopoly of medicine and put it into the power of the common folk. Okay. This also made medicine available to anyone who could read. So he was often called the champion of the little people. He then publishes a second book on midwifery. So I am told that he's often considered one of the biggest influences on modern Western midwifery, because he publishes a whole textbook on midwifery. He creates some groundbreaking theories. For example, he taught that infertility was not caused by evil spirits. It was caused by medical problems and problems with the physical organ, so some of this is just common sense, right? Culpepper became a little bit of a celebrity amongst the entire kind of kingdom, even though the physicians hate him. So, and then eventually he writes his masterpiece in 1652. He writes the Complete Herbal, this exact book, or sometimes called the English Physician. Okay. The Complete Herbal. He also priced it so cheap that anybody could afford it, even the common person. He had to have like underground renegade printing presses publish this. It was considered so controversial at the time. This is basically an herbal for the common person. It's a guide that anybody could use to heal themselves and get medical knowledge or healing knowledge. They couldn't read Latin, but a lot of people could read English though. Yeah. I'm sure not everybody, but a majority of people could. So he gave people the tools and knowledge to practice medicine in their own families. This book sold as far away as like China, all the way to the colonial America, because the colonies were all happening at this time, right? Right? Remember the Puritans? Those were the people on the Mayflower and that, right? Okay. So he had 7 children, only one lived. He eventually died of a chest infection he got in the war. The end. But the English herbal, there's some really cool things about this book. Are you ready? This is true statistic. English herbal is still the most successful non-religious book of all time in the English language on the entire planet. Let me say that again. Sounds too good to be true. The English herbal is still the most successful non-religious book of all time in the English language on the earth. Only the Bible is considered a more successful or popular book. Other than the Bible, this is the only other English book that has been in publication and never went out of publication in 350 years. So only the Bible and this book have been in continuous publication in the English language for 350 years. Isn't that cool? Okay. So he also fought censorship. His goal was to bring herbal medicine to the masses. He was rebellious against everybody, the medical community, the apothecaries, the king, the monarchy. He just rebelled against it all. He was just fighting for the common person. He was actually a self-taught astrologer and herbal medicine, because remember, his parents were, his father and grandfather were ministers, so they knew Latin. That's how he learned Latin. Okay. Some interesting kind of like divine things I find interesting about him. His first fiance was extremely wealthy. They were going to run away to get married, and she was struck by lightning and died the day before they were supposed to leave England. Yeah, this is interesting, like fate, destiny things, right? And then he later married somebody else. Yes. His first office was in what we would call like a Hathaway house, basically, because he wanted to serve the less fortunate. He would have been in a really rough part of town and a really rundown place, and that's where his first office was. So he is the common person's hero. So we owe a lot of herbal medicine wisdom to Culpepper. He doesn't get the credit that he deserves. So, okay. This is an important trend. I want everybody to know that during and after the Renaissance, all medical knowledge starts to get really controlled by a small group of these medical societies. This actually in America becomes the downfall of the homeopaths and the eclectics. It's all the history of medicine is about these medical societies, right? So homeopathists and herbal medicine doctors eventually, all the way up until the 1930s in America, actually 1940s, are practicing everywhere, but eventually the medical societies start to control who can take the exams. And that's how herbal medicine falls out in America, not because of popularity, but because of medical board control. And all the other groups were too busy fighting each other to realize what had happened. So they couldn't fight it. Then it happened.
There's something called by Rockefeller Gensler report.
Flexner report. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we'll talk about that. That was like the tool they used to. Yeah. Yeah, the Rockefellers founded this Flexner. True story. Yeah, Flexner report. Flexner report. It basically was just a survey of medical schools all across America and how good they were doing and graduation rates and like, other rates of funding and professors and student ratio, and actually most of the herbal medicine schools were doing, some of them were better than the even prestigious schools at the time. But it was used in a very bad way to just Tried to make it look like these other schools were not teaching anything. Yeah, it was a tool they used. Yeah. Okay, couple of points. Number one, he took on the establishment to bring natural medicine to the masses. He was in constant conflict. He waged a private war on medical knowledge. He is considered one of, if not the bestseller of books in English history. Okay. His book is still a continuation of Galen's work, but he starts to add some other twists and turns into it that we'll talk about. Okay. Okay, it's also important to know that he spent most of the time in the countryside with his mother when he was a child. And this is where he learns about midwifery from other wise women. And he learned about herbal medicine from all the grandmas and grandpas out in the countryside. And this is where he learned to harvest local plants and that. So this is like a huge influence that's not talked about a lot. Okay. This is also a time where tobacco was just coming to England. So we have like another big controversy, right? And you can imagine someone as in his rebelliousness, he was known to drink a fair amount of alcohol and partake of smoking, which made him even more of a rebel in the time. Okay. Okay. All the concepts that we use today in herbal medicine, by the time Culpepper writes, they're all set into motion. There's really nothing new that we write about or talk about. So he continues Galen's idea of hot and cold and dry and damp and internal and external. He actually talks about the degrees. So like an herb can be cold in the first, second, or third degree, which is not always how extreme it is. He also talks about, he is also renowned for introducing the idea of what we call organ affinities. Meaning, when you prescribe constitution, okay, so we have all of Galen's system, and then he's introducing a system of kind of like a little bit of like a medical astrology on top of it. He is further reinforcing the idea of the Constitution. This is still a real simple system of opposites, right? Like if you have a cold disease process, you need a hot herb. So it's still all the basics that we talk about. Talks a lot about all the other, right? Hot, cold, dry, wet, all of these things he's talking about. He's also introducing the idea of an organ affinity now. This is one of the last herbal natural medicine concepts we need. This is the idea that every herb has an affinity to go to certain parts of the body or organs. Okay. He actually writes about that. He understood this only through his own personal intuition and experience when he was younger. And then eventually he makes this part of his medical system. He also kind of really solidifies the concept of the Constitution from Galen and basically just says, again, your Constitution is everything that is you, right? Whether you like cold food or hot food, whether hot weather, cold weather, or damp weather, or dry weather bothers you, like this is your Constitution, okay? And every treatment must be individualized, okay? He does not get credited enough, okay? So yes, he did write this book on midwifery. He wrote 17 books in total. and translated many Greek writings into English. Said he did translate the secret guarded, basically herbal pharmacy of the doctors. But the complete herbal is his claim to fame. His last book that he wrote was published after he died. It's called A Treatise on Aurum Potable, which is it's a book on alchemy. I've never actually read it, but it sounds intriguing. Yeah. A treatise. It'll be in your notes. Yeah. Okay. He says his book, there's another famous herbalist around this time, a little bit before him, called Gerard, which publishes a book that's still used a little bit today. It was from France. He says his book is superior, do you know why, to Gerard's? This is also what Culpepper does. That's an important concept we still have today. Why is his book better than Gerard's? Even outside of all of this. Because his book focuses on English plants only. Because this is what the common folk would have access to, that they could just go harvest, right? This is about giving people the tools to truly take their healthcare into their own. They don't even have to go to the apothecary now. We're bypassing everybody. True empowerment, right? So he really creates the first idea of local herbalism or regional herbalism. The idea, I don't know if he really thought local plants were better, but I know he thought they were just more practical, because you should use what is around you. Okay. So he did everything he writes about, unlike Paracelsus, everything he writes about actually embraces Galen and Hippocrates and everybody before him. He just kind of further refines it and adds some key points. Okay. So this is often called organ pathology based herbalism, meaning we're wanting to know what organ is involved with the problem and which herbs go to that organ. So today we just take it for granted, like milk thistle is good for your liver. But before this time, maybe that was so simple, it just wasn't really talked about. Okay. Couple famous quotes. My all-time favorite quote of history. I almost cry when I read this. So you have to think of the time, okay? One of his simple quotes is English herbs for English bodies. That's really basic. Talks about local plants for local people. Writing about the doctors of the time who are doing bloodletting and really crude surgery, right? Most people are dying from surgery. Quote, you can see why maybe people didn't like him. Quote, they are bloodsuckers, true vampires, and have learned nothing since Hippocrates, which is true. I mean, that's the way they were practicing. Okay. And related to organ affinities, he has this beautiful quote, in all disease, strengthen the part of the body affected. Okay, I'm leading up to his big one. One of his other really good quotes is, many a times I find my patients disturbed by trouble of conscience or sorrow, and I have to act the divine before I can be the physician. In fact, our greatest skill lies in the infusion of hopes to induce confidence and peace of mind. This would have been a radical idea back then. People were not talking about patient-centered care, right? But this is my favorite quote of his, one of the greatest quotes you'll ever read in life related to medicine. I kind of lived my healing philosophy by this. Ready? This is not being pleasing and less profitable to me. I consulted with my two brothers, Dr. Reason and Dr. Experience, and took a voyage to visit my mother, Nature, by whose advice, together with the help of Dr. Diligence, I at last obtain my desire, in being warned by Mr. Honesty, a stranger in our days, to publish it to the world, and I have done it. So, so cool. So Dr. Reason, Dr. Experience, Dr. Diligence, and Mr. Honesty. And then he shared it with the world. Isn't that cool? It's one of my all-time favorite quotes. And when you read his book, this is a great herbal. Everybody should have this in your book collection. For example, St. John's wort, right? This is what it's going to say. This is his book, right? This is the same thing it's been forever. Okay. I'm going to read this. St. John's wort. This is a beautiful shrub and is an ornament in our meadows. Description. Here's going to talk about botany, right? I don't want to read it all, but common St. John's wort shoots forth brownish, upright, hard, round stalks, 2 feet high, spreading many branches from the sides up, on and on and on. Here he's talking about who looks like this plant, but is not this plant. He's going to have a whole way to identify this. There's like a whole paragraph on botany. Okay. Place. Here he's talking about environment. This grows in the woods, as well as spots that are shady and open to the sun. Time, they flower about midsummer and July, and the seed is ripe by the end of July. So he's talking about more botany stuff, right? Okay, remember, if you were in common folk, you wouldn't have botany training, so this would be your guide. So here's the part I love. Government and virtues. It is under the celestial sign Leo in the dominion of the sun. So here's like an alchemical background, right? He's talking about the planetary influences. It may be if you meet the papist, he will tell you, especially if he be a lawyer, that St. John's wort made it over to him by letter of attorney. It is a singular wound herb, boiled in wine and drank. It heals inward hurts and bruises. Made into an ointment, it opens obstructions, dissolves swellings, and closes up the lips of wounds. The decoction of the herb and flowers, especially of the seed, being drank in wine, with the juice of knotgrass, helps all manners of vomiting and spitting of blood. It is good for those that are bitten or stung by any venomous creature, and for those that cannot make water. 2 drams of the seed of St. John's wort made into a powder and drank in a little broth doth gently expel choler and congealed blood in the stomach. The decoction of the leaves and seeds drank somewhat warm before the fits of agues, whether they be tertains or quatrains, alters the fits, and by often using doth take them quite away. So he's talking about epileptic fits, right? And fits from fevers and infections. The seed is much commended, being drunk for 40 days together to help the sciatia, the falling sickness, right? Vertigo, dizziness, and the palsy. So it's a really good herbal. It's really, really, really good herbal. A lot of people forget this. Back of this book has a bunch, like hundreds of recipes from the physicians of the time that were closely guarded. So he publishes all that in here. It's very cool. It's got a lot of cool stuff. So he has medicines of the heart, medicines of the lungs, medicines of the breast, medicines of the liver. And here he tells you what a liver disease looks like. So you can know how to identify it, right? I forgot about that part. He's using action category names. I love it. Be pleased to take these under the name hepatics. So he's talking about liver herbs and hepatics. Like I said, almost everything by his time is kind of put into place. Spleen, bladder. It's a cool book. I hope everybody appreciates him and all of his cool contributions. The BBC did an old, amazing hour-long special on him that is missing now, but I have it on a memory stick. I'd like to play it for class sometimes. They did an amazing job of detailing why he was such an important English historical figure. So that's all that I know about Nicholas Culpepper. So when you see this book, it's more than just a book, right? This is a amazing feat, right? Should inspire us all to take power to the people, right? I'll pass this around too. Comfrey's got pictures, drawings of the plants, all in one little book. Okay. Questions on Culpepper? So he's often considered an astro-herbalist, but that's just like a little part of what he did. I mean, I think a lot of people make it sound like that's all that he did. That was just like a little bit of his insight into his wisdom. So, okay, questions on Culpepper? No? No questions on Culpepper? Okay.